All right, many of you have probably heard in the last couple months, there's been some news stories out there about how the Parliament of Iceland is going to consider whether or not to ban infant circumcision. Uh, Now, most of you also know that I'm interested in both these topics, both Iceland and circumcision, and I thought that this would be a good opportunity to examine some of the aspects of the controversy. Not all of them, because it's, I think, a big topic and an interesting one. So the first thing, I had the opportunity to speak with one of my friends who lives in Iceland, who's lived there for about 10 years. And he gave me the rundown on what the process is. And basically, this is not something that's going to happen, immediately, but it's been introduced. It has to go to committee, and eventually it will go to a vote. Interestingly, this is a topic where there's kind of a bipartisan, if you want to call it that, and the politics in Iceland not quite as bicameral or by two party as they are in the United States, but there's support both on the left wing along body integrity lines and on the right wing, essentially on the for two reasons. One being uncircumcised is kind of the traditional thing in Iceland. If you go there, very, very few people are circumcised. I think it's less than 1% of the population. Um, on the other hand, they also view it as a kind of a deterrent to Muslim integration or Muslims. Because basically in Iceland, we're talking about two groups that are going to be affected by this, Jews and Muslims. Now, interestingly, even though it's likely that there's some degree of anti-Muslim immigration behind at least part of the motivation for this bill, and that would be on the right wing. That's not the motivation probably on the left wing. And my friend, by the way, thinks that there's actually a very good chance that this is going to pass eventually, but we'll see. Um, there's been a huge outcry, especially from Jewish sectors. Now, in Iceland, there's only about 250, less than 300 Jews, and about 1,000 more than that Muslims in the country. So very small populations. I haven't heard of much outcry on the part of the Muslim population, um, but among Jews, and especially not just Jews who live in Iceland, but Jews who live in other parts of the world, especially Europe and the United States, there is definitely been a cry of anti-Semitism and talk of sanctions, a talk of and this is stuff that Iceland's sensitive to. Iceland has an economy that is almost totally dependent on tourism, and any kind of controversy that would lower tourism, and especially any kind of legal sanction from a major European country like the UK or from the United States, especially. This is stuff that, and this is something that would be a problem for Iceland. And this is where most of the concern about the bill is. There isn't much debate in Iceland about the ethics of the bill itself. There's fear about a potential backlash. Now, I don't know how likely a backlash actually is, or at least a strong backlash. There's going to be some. There's rhetorical backlash. Is it going to manifest as sanctions or any kind of dip in tourism? I don't know. I don't think anybody does know. And I'm not really going to speculate because I have no idea. But this kind of brings up one of the one of the main justifications for circumcision, and that's the religious justification. Now, in Europe and in other parts of the world, the religious justification is a more cogent one. In the United States, this is less true because the overwhelming majority of circumcisions are not done for religious reasons or for any religious pretext whatsoever. Um, However, whenever you get into a debate about circumcision, inevitably you get hit with this, well, there's a religious exception. And I think that that's a worthwhile thing to talk about. So, and then there's a related straw man here, I think, where people who advocate against circumcision, or at least against infant circumcision, or there's a totally different ethical standard if we're talking about adults. And, my standard for adults is a lot lower than most people. But consenting people can get circumcised, and that's does not raise the same moral issues as doing it to non-consenting, infants essentially. But this almost always will be met with cries of anti-Semitism. Now, there are anti-Semites out there, and I'm sure that there are some anti-Semites who are uh, at least partially motivated by their intactivism. I think that's a real phenomenon, although I think it's a quite rare one. It's and the reason it's a straw man is that it's possible to raise completely secular arguments against circumcision that have nothing to do with religion. That's certainly not my motivation. We have a lot of Jews who, by the way, are kind of spearheading this. If you look, a lot of the literature, a lot of the research, a lot of the activism is actually coming from Jews. So we're back to the, well, I guess those would be self-hating anti-Semitic Jews in that case. I mean, several of the books that I've read are by Jewish authors who are extremely anti-circumcision. But it's it's just a very lazy attempt to strawman people and say, well, you're being anti-Semitic. Well, not necessarily. Um, you could make the argument that cutting off the penises or parts of the penises of Jews is anti-Semitic because from the point of view of the intactivists, you're performing a mutilation and sexual reduction surgery, essentially, literally. And isn't that more anti-Semitic than actually, imposing that onto the child of Jewish parents or Muslim parents? So this religious exception, though, is worth looking at. I believe very strongly in the freedom of religion. I think people should be able to practice their religions, but there are limits to that, and the limits of that are you can't practice your religion on other people. You can evangelize, you can proselytize, you can try and persuade people, but you can't go and do anything that you want because of some religious mandate. And this is understood. People make this exception. Oh, well, it's mandated by Judaism. Well, a lot is mandated by Judaism. If we look, the Old Testament doesn't just say, well, Jews have to circumcise on the 8th day and that's it. There's a whole plethora of other dictates and mandates that are in there, and the vast majority of them are not followed even by very Orthodox observant Jews or fundamentalist Christians. And there's a side to there's many religious practices that we would not condone, even though they're clearly religious. So we don't accept female circumcision because even though it's religious. And there's a debate there. People say, well, the Quran doesn't mandate female circumcision, doesn't mandate male circumcision either, but the Hadith talks about both, and that is part of the religious teachings of Muslims. It's just on a different order of magnitude. Just like in Judaism, you've got the Talmud and you've got the Old Testament, and they don't rank exactly the same, but they're both religious. You can't just say, well, it's in the Talmud, it's not in the Old Testament, so it's not Jewish. No, it's still Jewish and it's still religious, and stuff that's in the Hadith is still Islamic. There's also the issue with many people believe that something is religious, even if textually that's not the case. And we get this with Christians and circumcision. There's a lot of Americans who believe that they are circumcising for religious reasons, even though, as best we can tell, scholarly speaking, they are not. The covenant, the New Testament basically eliminated the need for this covenant among Christians, and that but there are various Christian sects who kind of believe it. I've heard of people who, their parents are from a circumcising culture. They're not Jewish, they're Christian, but they read the Old Testament, they see the stuff about circumcision, and they go, oh, this is religiously mandated, and so they think that it is. And that belief is, even if it's erroneous, is perfectly sincere. And if we're talking about allowing things or disallowing things because of religion, the sincere belief is probably good enough. I mean, there isn't an objective fact about what is and what is not religious. We can say what's objectively in the texts, but that is only that is not a perfect correlation with what's in the religion, right? Judaism is not a clone of the Old Testament, nor is it even a clone of the Talmud or any combination of their religious texts. It is woven in with cultural, historical, and social practices to a degree that can't really be separated. You can see some of the textual influences for sure, and circumcision is a good example of that. But there's the way that they interact is really complicated, and you can't just parse out and say, well, this is the religious and this is not. And this goes into the whole, there's a very strong resistance to the idea of considering female circumcision and male circumcision in any way analogous. And one of the ways people like to make them distinct, and I think in principle they are analogous. There are certainly differences, and with female circumcision, there's a broader range of practices than typically there is for male circumcision, although there's actually a range there as well. Um, but people will say, well, look, female circumcision is not religious, it's cultural. Well, actually, most of the people who practice it believe that it is religious, and there is, like I said, in the Hadith, it is talked about. So it's not exactly correct to say it's not religious. But even if it wasn't in the Hadith, the fact that millions of people do it, the millions of people associate it with a religion, it's hard to say that that in and of itself is not religion. Doesn't count as religion then. Um, Even if you can scholarly look at the Quran and say it's not actually in there, just like male circumcision is not actually in there. Uh, but again, it's question begging. Why is it okay to make an exception for a religious reason but not for a cultural reason? To me, this sounds like a distinction without a difference. The sincere beliefs you have about your culture are not necessarily any less sincere than the ones you have about your religion. So I don't understand why one and not the other. But then the other broader point is, where's the line here? Can you stone your children to death because it's in the Old Testament? Um, can you immolate your widow at your funeral like they used to do in Hinduism? Can you cut off the hands of thieves like is mandated in parts of Sharia? There's a lot of stuff that is in religious teaching, religious doctrine that we just would not accept. Oh yeah, you can do that. And it's special pleading to be like, well, this is an accept, and this is where some of there's an exception because we're Jewish. That actually kind of breeds a little anti-Semitism. I've seen in debates where I'm thinking about one in particular here where a Jewish gentleman was, to his credit, was even admitting, like, I get it that it's sexual reductive surgery. I get it that it's a violation of the rights of the child. I get it that there's a strong argument for bodily integrity, but it doesn't matter. I'm Jewish. There's an exception. Jews can do it. And so what he was basically conceding, and most people would not be that frank or obvious. They would kind of sidestep through other territory about trying to make a positive health, justification for the procedure. But he was basically saying it doesn't matter what the arguments are, because I'm Jewish, I'm allowed to violate all the rights of the child. That's basically what he said. And there are actually, you can find quotes of rabbis and stuff saying, yeah, this is assault. This is actually, it's barbaric. It's an assault. I'm harming the child. It's harmful. It doesn't do any. I'm not doing it. Either there is no benefit, or I'm not doing it because of any of the benefits. I'm just doing it because the Bible says so. That's the only reason. And where's the line there? Now, my argument is that I don't think you can really draw a line there. If you want to raise a child religious, that's fine. If you want to indoctrinate them into Orthodox Judaism, that's fine. If you want to feed them a certain diet, if you want to send them to certain schools, if you want to dress them a certain way, that's fine. But you can't arthur their bodies surgically. You can't kill them. You can't give them scarification. And people don't like to think about it this way, but circumcision is minimally scarification, but it's actually more than that because you're removing healthy tissue on top of the scarification. So it's definitely crossing a big ethical line. Now, we can get into how I feel about bans. Obviously, I'm an anarchist. I don't like the idea of the state banning things. I much prefer the idea of having there be a common law where this is considered an aggressive act, where parents, doctors, hospitals would be liable to damages to either the child or anyone who sues on the child's behalf. I think that would effectively discourage it. I think that people should be ostracized. I think that people should be, there should be insurance consequences. There should be hospital consequences. There should be employment consequences for doing this. But I don't necessarily believe that a ban is the best way to go about it. But if we live in a state society, and we're going to have a state, and the state is going to exist to protect the rights of the people, and of individual peoples more specifically, then this definitely falls within the purview of such a state. And it's just fascinating how much this topic enters into special pleading, right? If one of the books I was reading made the point, like if the doctor if the doctor went and just fondled a newborn, an 8-day-old baby and just played with his penis, that would be a serious crime. That would be a felony. Um, Even though that would not really do any damage, the baby would not remember that. It wouldn't be traumatic. But if he were to cut the foreskin off, remove it, something that is going to be extremely traumatic, it's going to produce an enormous amount of stress and going to have consequences one way or the other for the rest of the baby's life, then that would be considered okay. And it's interesting to juxtapose the vast differential there. Or if he was to go, if a doctor was to go and start circumcising 8-year-olds or 10-year-olds on a playground, nobody would sit there and say, "Oh yeah, that's fine." They would say, "That's bizarrely barbaric. That's that's assault and battery. That's molestation." That would be like on the level of rape again. And we're talking about inflicting harm. Like murder is the worst, and then inflicting injuries are bad, but like amputation is the next worst thing though. If you're removing a body part. Now, granted, removing the foreskin is not as terrible as removing the arm or the leg, but it's pretty terrible. So again, very interesting that while there's an exception for the religion. And I think I should talk about this a little bit. The way Jews have practiced circumcision has all changed over the years. We know that the initial type of circumcision practiced, starting in the whenever the Old Testament was written, if not before, was a much more a much less invasive form, where basically the very tip of the foreskin was removed, but the head was not completely uncovered. Skin was left so that you could still have protection and coverage of the head, which will actually leave a lot of function. I actually know people who are circumcised in that way, and they actually don't even look circumcised, and functionally they are pretty close to uncircumcised. They're missing a few little bit. The ringed band at the tip of the prepuce is gone, so they're missing some nerve endings there and some musculature, but it's very close to being uncircumcised. And indeed, the people that I know who are like this grew up believing that they were uncircumcised and didn't discover that they'd had minimal circumcision surgeries when they were pretty young. And this was the standard form of circumcision practice in Judaism up until about the 1st century of the Common Era. During that period, Palestine, Israel, Judea had come under this first political and then much longer after that cultural domination by Greek culture. And this Hellenistic influence, one of the things that it did, aside from a lot of Jews, speaking and talking and doing commercial actions in Greek, was the Greeks thought of circumcision as barbaric. They thought the human body was perfect as it was created, and that altering it with a mutilation was, really absurd. And they didn't. I think that there were attempts to outlaw it to more or less to one degree or another, but if you wanted to get along in Hellenistic society, and the Romans were similar also to the Greeks, although not as extreme, it was necessary it would behoove a Jew to pass himself off as uncircumcised. And so what they would sometimes do is they have these little stones called Jewish stones, and they actually have archaeological examples of this, that they would basically attach to their foreskins, and over time this would elongate them and make them look more uncircumcised. And in fact, if you do this enough, it can basically look completely uncircumcised to the untrained eye, or even the trained eye, if you do a good enough job. There was a rabbinical backlash against this. Rabbis saying, look, this is a covenant with God. You can't cheat God, so to speak, or you get circumcised and then pretend to be uncircumcised. And so the procedure was radicalized to make it totally unambiguous. Someone who has just the very tip, the frontal band removed, can pass for uncircumcised. And so there can be some dispute there. But if you totally uncover the head, if you remove all the skin that covers it, then you are in an undeniable territory where there can't be hidden. And so the practice was radicalized and made much more invasive. But then, of course, you have the diaspora, you have the fall of the temple, and you have the rise of the rabbinate. And over the course of that long period of time, this whole ceremonial process was developed, uh, and it was a multi-stage process. And what's interesting is that most of that has been abandoned, right? So like, I can't remember all the names, but the first stage in the circumcision, and again, circumcisions weren't performed in hospitals or by doctors; they're performed by mohels, which are, specially designated Jewish authorities whose job it is to circumcise babies. It's very unsanitary. Uh, they would initially cut off the tip, then they would peel the skin off the head, sometimes using their thumbnail as a wedge to peel it off. This would be sort of like peeling your fingernails off your skin. There's a mucous membrane that seals the two together. In almost all newborns, there's about 1% of newborns who are born with the ability to fully retract, but that's very unusual. And then cut off the rest. And this is a practice a lot of people have heard of, and it strikes people as extremely bizarre. They would suck the blood out of the penis, out of the newly cut penis. And there's actually, and this last step was called the metzitza. And which is interesting is in the 19th century, excuse me, in the 18th, yeah, in the 19th century, you started to have a lot of reform movements within Judaism. And a lot of the stuff um, in the Old Testament was discarded. A lot of the dietary restrictions, the Sabbath keeping, the authority of the rabbinate. That's when you started getting temple again. If you ever talk to Reform Jews and they don't go to synagogue, they go to temple. This is a result of that, and you had a lot of questioning, and a lot of people were at the same time questioning just the health of this procedure. There were cholera epidemics, there were syphilis epidemics, and a lot of people were saying, look, this we should be enlightened enough to recognize that this is a questionable procedure. Now, obviously, the hardliners could always make the religious, hey, this is our religious. Now, the Bible doesn't say anything about metzitza. There's no part of the Bible that mandates that, but that was just as part of the religion as the stuff, the covenant that God demands in Genesis. And it's fascinating because you eventually get to a point where in the United States it's a large percentage of Jews are atheists, and I've had atheist Jews tell me we can't stop circumcising because it's a covenant with God, and it's like, you don't even believe God is real. Why do you need to have a covenant with an imaginary deity? So what's fascinating, and there's a good book on this if I can find it. Here we go. If anyone's interested. This is by one of those Jewish authors I was referencing earlier. It's called Marked in Your Flesh, Circumcision from Ancient Judea to Modern America by Leonard Glick. This is a pretty fascinating book if you're interested in the topic. And of all the various cultural, religious strictures that Orthodox Jews were following, reformers basically annihilated most of them, but the most resistant was circumcision, which is fascinating because there's nothing in the religious text that makes it especially necessary. There were a few reformers who talked about maybe ending the practice, but this was quite rare, and it was met with a horrible backlash. And I think that there's probably some interesting reasons why reforming away circumcision was met a much stronger backlash than, say, reforming away from Sabbath keeping or the dietary restrictions of kosher, or wearing the yarmulke, or any number of other practices that were basically reformed away from for a lot of Jews, not all. Interesting aside, so metzitza is still practiced, by the way. There are still fundamentalist Jews who practice it. If you go online, you can find articles of like herpes outbreaks in New York City from rabbis who are spreading this. So there's still people who do it and who will look, this is my religious belief. I sincerely hold it. It's a religious mandate. So it's not just like this religious exception is only for circumcision. It's for every part of circumcision. And as a kind of an aside, in modern Israel, the term for a blowjob is a metzitza, which is kind of makes sense, but also kind of a little weird. But the point is that there's clearly been reform within the religion, and that the tenets that were originally considered absolutely must have degraded. And I think it's interesting. Like, you can still read Hebrew, you can still play with dreidels, you can still go to the synagogue or to temple, you can still wear a yarmulke, you can still go to Israel, you can still do all these things. You can be an observant Jew and just have a foreskin, right? It's not like you're going to go to temple and they've got a sauna and you're all going to go back there and they're going to say, "Oh, get out! You've got a foreskin. You can't be a Jew." They have already Modern Jews are so far disconnected, and this is probably even true of Orthodox. From I mean, and there's even the thing like the way Orthodox dress. That's not from the Temple Judaism or the Kingdom of Solomon. That's like the way that the Polish people dressed in the 1500s, right? It's a cultural adaptation, not a religious mandate. Um, so your right to impose your religion on your children, I think it's a strong right. Like, you can definitely indoctrinate them. Essentially, you can teach them. You can do all that, but you can't like physically change their body. You can't go and start cutting away pieces. And I think one of the reasons that it's so strongly resisted. I think there's two. One is it's psychological. There's something about circumcision that is psychologically self-perpetuating. You get this phenomenon called the adamant father. If you've been circumcised, there's a strong likelihood that you are going to want your son to be circumcised as well. And it's not a function of you feel like it's so amazing and you feel like it's so great that you just for the betterment of your son you want him to be circumcised. You don't have anything to compare it to. You have no basis for concluding that it's quote great relative to being uncircumcised. There's a lot of, and this is another thing I really don't like about this debate. People like to bring up all this stuff about, well, what about STDs and UTIs and what about HIV and what about blah 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 blah. And it's like, I don't like this because uh, it's intellectually dishonest. That's not the reason people are getting circumcised. No one got circumcised because of these HIV studies in Uganda. Nobody is getting circumcised so that their chances of catching a UTI go from 1% to 0.5%. No one is getting circumcised because there's a 1 in 100,000 chance that they won't get penile cancer when they're in their 70s or 80s. Those are all rationalizations. The real reasons are just cultural and or religious. And these so-called perks, all of which are very debatable, and even if they exist, are exaggerated and based on the faulty calculus of just assuming the loss of the foreskin is completely um, in and of itself not harm, that you're not losing anything. And that's a whole other interesting topic where the value and the function and the purpose of the foreskin is omitted in American culture. It's omitted, like literally omitted from most medical textbooks. I've just seen they've done a survey. Something like 75 or 80% of medical textbooks do not show anything about foreskin except to say how to cut it off, and that's it. But yeah, so fathers who are doing this are not doing it because they've made a cost-benefit analysis. It was done to them, so they want to do it to their sons. It's called the adamant father syndrome. And mothers are kind of a weak link here, but if they're from a culture that is primarily circumcised, then they can be habituated to the idea that uncircumcised is undesirable, that it's dirty, even though that's not true. That the best evidence is that uncircumcised dicks are more, they're evolved, they're adapted to facilitate pleasurable sex between men and women, and reducing the member in that way is not going to be advantageous for either partner. That's a whole other topic. I won't get into that, but this is probably the reason why, though, circumcision has resisted most changes, whereas other religious tenets have not. Because if you follow kosher, that's not going to psychologically predispose you to make sure your son does kosher as well, in the same way that being circumcised is going to do so. But again, it's fascinating that it's reformed so much, and then it's like, no, this one little bit we can't possibly this one thing we can't reform. It's just unthinkable. Even though, as far as I can tell, you can be a Jew and be uncircumcised. I have Jewish friends who are uncircumcised. There are parts of the world where Jews tend to not be circumcised, and they're still considered Jews. Now, there's going to be an argument here that, like, I'm not Jewish, so I'm not allowed to have an opinion, or I can't talk about it. I can talk about it. If you want to just discount everything that I'm saying, that's fine. I can totally direct you to Jewish people who are saying exactly the same thing. So I think that that's a really lousy argument. Like as if it comes the same words coming out of a different person's lips enhances them in some way. There's very little here, by the way, that I'm not getting from Jewish. I have entire books. I mean, Jewish perspective. Ronald Goldman, PhD. Yeah, he's definitely an anti-Semite. Right, so like many topics, Jews are overrepresented when it comes to academic studies, and that's discussions about circumcision are no exception to that. But if you're Jewish and you're watching this and you don't want to believe a Gentile, then you can go read a Jew talking about it, because there's nothing I'm saying that they haven't already said 10 times better for that matter. So yeah, the religious exception, that is not a blank check to do whatever you want. Um, I'm all for people raising their kids to believe a certain religion, and I put the point at which someone can choose to circumcise themselves earlier than most people. So like legally right now, you would kind of have to be 18 to choose to do that for yourself, and I think that it should be quite a bit younger than that, probably more like 13. But here's the sneaking suspicion I think a lot of pro-circumcision people understand. If they wait, the odds that the person will choose not to do it go up astronomically, right? The baby has no choice. They can scream, they can struggle, unless there is some kind of medical emergency that's protecting them. And again, I know people who are this case. Their parents wanted them circumcised, but they were born underweight, and the doctor's like, we should not do surgery, and they kind of slipped through the cracks. As soon as you start waiting until kids are older and they can start expressing their preferences, it becomes much harder. People make this argument that like, well, it's just easier to do the surgery when they're younger. It's easier because they can't resist. It's actually more dangerous, right? The risk that an infant is going to suffer some kind of complication is much higher. A surgery at that age, when you're a week old or barely a week old, is much higher than if it happens when you're 18 or 19 or 20. Also, at that age, the ethical questions go away, and they can even, hey, well, I wanted to. They can specify what they want. Do they want it loose? Do they want it tight? You don't get to do any of that when you're doing an infant. You just do what the parents want, or the doctors impose. But I think it's understood, because people look at it like, well, most guys who are circumcised say they enjoy it. They don't feel like there's a problem, and so it must be superior. Like that's not the right metric, because they have nothing on which to compare it to. The metric is, do people who are uncircumcised choose to get circumcised? And if the answer is no, that means that they show that they like having their foreskins, and indeed most guys do. Now, the distinction between the foreskin and the rest of the penis is somewhat of an arbitrary distinction. So a lot of uncut guys do not consciously have a distinct estimation of the value of the prepuce relative to the rest of the foreskin. It's a integrated whole, and you don't. It would be like no one goes around thinking, I really value my feet. You just like being able to walk. You like having locomotion, and you don't go like, yeah, this big toe and this big toe. It's just one big thing. That is until it gets cut off, and then you suddenly become much more cognizant of what's missing. But very, very few guys choose to get circumcised, and when they do, there's other reasons explaining some of those away. There's a lot of medical pressure to do it. It's over, in the United States especially, it's overprescribed as a treatment. But that's again a separate topic. Again, this topic is very, very multifaceted and could make entire videos about every part of it. But I think it's understood that if you don't circumcise them as babies, many of them are going to choose, no matter how much you religiously indoctrinate them, not to have it done. And that's not acceptable to a lot of people. And it's not just Jews. It's not acceptable to Gentiles. If you have a family where the men are circumcised, they don't want to leave it up to the child, because then the child could choose not to. And there's feelings of emasculation relative to that. The father could feel like, well, my son is intact and I'm not. Even if they will swear up and down that being circumcised is not a problem and there's no difference and blah, blah, blah. If there's no difference, then why not leave it be? Uh, it was a fascinating story here to show the degree to which the supposed benefits are just pretextual. Um, this man had taken his. I read this in this book, by the way. This is a great book that I'll probably cover at some point. Um, Man brings his son in. Doctor's trying to convince him to get circumcised, and he goes over the UTI stuff, the various claims about diseases and penis cancer. I think it might have been before the HIV stuff, but whatever. And the man said, I just don't find that very convincing. I feel like the doing the surgery to prevent to reduce the likelihood of these possible illnesses by some minuscule amount is just not worth having a surgery. And what's interesting is the doctor then fell back on a completely non-medical justification. He said, "Don't you want your son to look like you?" What is that? Is not a medical justification. That is clearly some kind of cultural mimetic prolongation there. And fascinating enough, the father said, "Yeah, good point. I'm uncircumcised, so let's leave him uncircumcised too." Um, but just fascinating that this doctor, right, is invoking a clearly non-medical rationale, and I think that's another thing that kind of colors all of this. Is it bothers me when we have a debate and people start bringing up like the supposed health benefits, and I do mean supposed, but it's like this is intellectually dishonest because you were not circumcised. If I'm talking to somebody who was circumcised, you weren't circumcised because of any of this. You were circumcised for religious or for cultural reasons, and you are going to get. It doesn't matter if we could show that none of these benefits were real. You would still want to circumcise your kids. You would still rationalize it, and you'd still justify it. Circumcision has gone through a series of rationalizations over the years. First, people thought that it would stop masturbation, that it would stop syphilis, that it would stop epilepsy, and then when that got disproven, they came up with new, it will stop, it will make you cleaner, and blah blah blah, and they just it's a cure in the search for a disease. Some people say it. So anyway, that's a little bit too general. I just wanted to say, like, religious freedom is important, but it's not a blank check to do anything. If we're going to draw a line, drawing a line at the amputation of part of a body part is probably a good place to draw it. And again, it is special pleading. What if the parents want to cut off an ear? What if the parents? I mean, actually, one of the examples given, um, uh, Jehovah's Witnesses don't believe that their children should get blood transfusions because impure blood, blah blah blah. That's a sincere religious belief, and yet most people would not say that they should be allowed to do that. Now, that's even I think not as bad in the sense that like they are refusing to take blood, whereas so it's a negative religious. Whereas the positive is like we're gonna cut something off. We're actually gonna cause harm as opposed to preventing cure, which is not quite as bad, but still bad. Most people would not agree with the Jehovah's Witnesses there, but they would agree that a parent can say, "Yeah, cut off his foreskin." So anyway, it looks like this is likely to pass in Iceland, but it may not. They may. It depends how much of a backlash there is, especially among the Jewish communities and apparently in Europe. Although the potential is much greater in the United States if there was this concerted effort. I just wonder how many. Then not that many people care about Iceland enough to work up, but there's going to be a lot of disingenuous claims of anti-Semitism. Again, the arguments against circumcision do not rely on anti-Semitism whatsoever. There's no need to go there. I think that it's just a fallacious argument to try and turn the debate in that way. But this wouldn't be the first time that people used a fallacious argument to try and prove their point. So anyway, I just want to talk about that, and I will talk to you all another day. Bye bye.